Just going to interject and ask Professor Murphy about the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, and just just for her to speak on some of the positive impacts it's had and why the UK needs to implement some similar policy on that front.
Yeah, I certainly can. And I will say that I do think that the UK should have not specifically a Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. I think there should be a blanket ban on the import of forced labor-made goods that, as I mentioned a second ago, includes a rebuttable presumption for all situations of state-imposed forced labor. I don't think you should be importing goods from North Korea either, right? I'm opposed to all forms of state-imposed forced labor, and because we can't, as we were saying a second ago, because we cannot audit in places like that, we should have a universal rule that everywhere that applies, we don't import those goods. And so there would be no need to have a Uyghur specific one or a Uyghur region specific one, because it should already be in the law that we don't abide by that, right? In terms of successes, I think a lot of countries that are considering adopting a Tariff Act style law, something where we have a forced labor import ban or something similar, they're often anxious about whether or not it's successful. And the metric for success is often like, well, you can't stop everything. And the argument I make is, we don't stop all murders, but we don't throw away our prohibition on murder, right? We don't catch all counterfeits, but we don't say, well, okay, let's just let it in, right? But right now, what's going on in the UK is people are saying, well, I don't know, it could be really hard for us. So and we won't ever be able to be fully successful. So let's just not have a law that prohibits goods made with forced labor. And aside from from green tech, from renewables and PPE, essentially you could ship something to the UK that had a stamp on it that said made with slave labor, and it might be stopped under the prohibition on importing goods made with prison labor, but it might not be. And so, or Proceeds of Crime Act might be stopped for that, but it probably wouldn't. And so, like, the UK government needs a law that would effectively address this, doesn't have it. And the reason we know it is possible is because we've seen it work in the US. So first of all, there are like several different metrics we might consider. I'll just run through it quickly, but maybe, James, if you could put the article I published a couple weeks ago at CSIS on the impact of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the chat. People, you can, if you want to dig more deeply, you can do that. To my mind, the questions are that we need to ask, what are the metrics here? One would be, is it enforceable? Can a government actually enforce the law? The answer is yes. We've watched CBP do it. Does it change supply chains? Does it change corporate behavior? The answer is yes. We're watching massive supply chains. We can see it in the customs records. We can see it in corporate disclosures. Companies are changing their supply chains to comply with the UFLPA, and they're saying explicitly, we're clean for the US. And then they say nothing about what's going to the UK, right? And that's a silence that speaks volumes. And so, yes, they can and do change their supply chains to be compliant. The other question would be, is there a penalty to pay for non-compliance? Do the companies that continue to use forced labor pay a price? And we are seeing significant losses taken by companies that are added to the UFLPA entity list, and we can see it in their accounting statements. We can see it in the claims that they're making about the losses they're taking. We can see it in their investor reports. So there is a cost to it refusing to give up forced labor, right? And then lastly, is it helping the Uyghurs? And that is a harder thing for us to figure out, because we cannot get on the ground and talk to Uyghurs in a way that is unfettered and allows them the freedom to express what they're feeling. However, we are seeing the Chinese government change and shift and move the way they're repressing the Uyghurs. Don't get me wrong, there is still massive repression in the region. Forced labor is still very much endemic, but the Chinese government is having to like change its tune, it's changing its directives, it's changing its public explanations of what they're doing because of the pressure we're putting on them. It hasn't made like everyone free, but it is changing the terms of the debate and what China thinks they have to do to justify what they're doing there, and that is significant. And we have seen people be released from the camps. We have seen people who have less surveillance, while it still maintains very much a surveillance state that is very oppressive. So on all those counts, I think we're seeing real change. And I think we can say that the UFLPA is a success, but they still need to do more. The US needs to work harder.
Alan Crawford has a question for Luke. Is there any talk in the UK to encourage establishment of a solar supply chain in the UK, specifically production of ingots, wafers and cells? There does seem to be module capacity. Wacker and Hemlock have sufficient solar poly capacity to support UK ingot production.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'd also like to bring Laura in on this because I know that she's been involved in some discussions around it. Look, at the policy level, this has certainly been raised on a number of meetings that I've been in. And you get a slightly incredulous raised eyebrow back from the other side, where the answer is something like our production capacity is negligible compared to how much we want to procure. And, you know, that's about it, really. I think the discussion which has a little bit more legs in it is, given the sheer differential in terms of cost, where else there might be the possibility of sort of creating or seeding alternate markets to China, where I think there are discussions ongoing, and India has certainly been mentioned in that context, and not India alone. But I think the direct answer to you, Alan, is not seriously, because they do not think that we can get to the capacity that we need to at the cost that we need to in order to deliver on our targets in time. Laura will know more.
No, I think that's the answer. And I think if anybody here knows the answer, it's probably Alan. So, but I think he was just a little bit optimistic that there was something he didn't know yet. And I think the answer is nah. There's not a lot of hope on the horizon, but I think we do need to keep encouraging it, and keep explaining that, you know, the polysilicon industry in the Uyghur region grew up in like 5 years. I mean, it just popped up. And so people say, oh, it takes a really long time. But in fact, it didn't take long for that industry to emerge and then to become dominant. And so I don't think we should consider just the timeline. And though, Alan, you have more realistic thoughts on this than I do, and more grounded in the realities. But I don't think we should have the timeline as the only excuse. I do think cost is a significant barrier. And I think looking to places and regions, I was talking to somebody in Australia yesterday, talking about access to hydro energy in Australia being an incentive to move some polysilicon production there. But as you know, Alan's pointing out, the part that's missing is the module or the wafer to cells. And that takes less energy, takes less time to build up, fewer resources, and it has less environmental impact. And that would be something that I think the UK should be looking very carefully. Everyone should be looking carefully at that, wafers to cells, because that is the region too where China completely holds us captive. Even if you buy your polysilicon in Germany, it goes to China to get processed into wafers, ingots, and cells. And that's something we should all be pushing for. And that I think Alan does a really good job of promoting, but we all need to be promoting it.
Finley Colville asks, with more than 80% of module suppliers outsourcing all their cells to multiple suppliers, themselves with multiple wafer and ingot suppliers, is the fundamental problem for the solar industry coming from the outside world scrutinizing module suppliers and having them describe upstream segments they don't participate in? Does the solar industry not need a transparent matrix of supply chains where ingot, wafer, and cell companies are equally scrutinized, even before addressing the issue of polysilicon and industrial grade supply?
Luke, I'm gonna go ahead. If you're okay.
Are you kidding? I just put that question into ChatGPT, and all it can say is, "What an excellent and structured question."
Yeah, so I think that what we're talking about here is really reliant on the difference between transparency and traceability. And one thing that I've learned in the process of doing this work from module manufacturers themselves is that module manufacturers know exactly where everything comes from down to the polysilicon. They know to the module, to the batch, right? They know that this module was made with this batch of polysilicon made in this factory on this date. They know it that well. It is that traceable. Problem is transparency. We don't know what batch, and then what batch of polysilicon got made and which ingot wafer cell factories it went through to get to this module. We have no visibility into that anymore. We used to have some visibility into it, and we were able to draw these maps where we had, you know, it could be going here, it could be going there. We know this company's buying this much, so it could be doing this. We were able to map it out somewhat, and you're saying, don't we need more information than that? We absolutely do, but we at least had some information. At this point, we have almost no information. They have every bit of information they need to be able to tell us exactly whether the module we're holding in our hands is clean or not. And if we go back to MGS, if we go back to the metallurgical grade silicon, that is the precursor of polysilicon, they were not tracking that before. But now they have to if they want to ship to the United States. And so you know they do for at least some portion of their product. And so what we need is not more traceability necessarily. That's already there. Well, at least to the polysilicon. We need more traceability beyond polysilicon, and we need more transparency so that consumers can know what they're buying, and so that the UK can know how much of what they're getting is the tainted stuff, because so much of the untainted stuff is going to the US. That's really what I think is up. I might not have answered your question, but I hope I did.
Alex Harris asks, can any standards body funded by the suppliers, e.g. SSI, maintain enough credibility as an arm's length body to be used as a reliable standard for private industry? Is there any other realistic funding method that will allow for a fully audited and tested supply chain?
Luke, you want to start?
I think all I'd do here is say that there are new technologies and companies around which are trying to help us with this. You might be aware that a number of companies have developed the ability to do isotopic forensic supply chain testing. And I understand that they are moving into polysilicon or being able to test it. That at least provides some kind of ability to do some spot checking, which is a bit reliable and independent and scientific. So that's outside of the need to create a marking your own homework type body, and put it that way. But not only them, you know, there are other companies too which have developed the ability at least to, you know, use AI for these purposes and to try to put together, join some of the dots. So I think that there is a way of doing this which actually doesn't depend on the sort of usual suspect approaches. But Laura will have more.
I think I would point to the IRMA standards, it's Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance standards, as an alternative to a corporate-driven standards body. And IRMA was established in specific response to this exact problem, that in the mining industry, so many of the standards that were set by the mining companies themselves, and nobody trusted them. And so what IRMA did was, from its start, from its very essence, it was a multi-stakeholder initiative where the mining companies sat down with the labor unions and workers and governments and CSO communities and environmentalists, and together they came up with a set of standards. Those standards are high, and they are hard to meet. But companies are now moving towards trying to meet those standards that they set together in a situation that's extremely hard. We don't usually talk to each other across these walls. But IRMA said the only way we're going to trust you is if we can all be at the table, and they did it. And what's happening with most standards bodies, not all of them, but many of them, is that the stakeholders come in down the road after the standards have already been set, after the companies have already set the terms that are most comfortable and easiest for them to deal with. And that stakeholder engagement is not fundamental and integrated into the process, and therefore it's not going to build a trusting situation. I think there's an opportunity to change that, but it's going to take significant work and a lot more participation of people who would be more critical of the standards that are being set at this time.
Mark asks, with low embedded carbon and human rights being so important to GB Energy and other procurers of PV modules, has any consideration been given to establishing MGS and poly production within Africa, powered by solar energy rather than coal?
I wondered about that. So MGS production is really energy consuming. I've wondered if solar would be, if like a full solar circuit could be used. Can we ask Alan for, well, maybe here's what we'll do. I will ask Alan, because I see that we're out of time. I will ask Alan for an answer to that question. And can I send it back to you, James, and we can send it to the folks? I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's an important question. I think we should be considering, but I think the answer is no, but I want to make sure that somebody who really knows can answer it.
Absolutely. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone on the call. So
with Alan's permission, we'll have to check with Alan first.
Yeah, of course.
Would you cut and paste that question for me so I can make sure to send it to him?
Absolutely. I'll send it to you right away.
Thank you.
We are now out of time. I'd like to thank our speakers so much for your time